Rejoice, episode 202, Silk Stockings and Esprit de Corps. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Thank you so much for your generous donations, which are now helping to fund the daily tweet that goes by the name of hashtag Rejoicings. That's REJOYCEINGS. The necessarily pithy tweets, 140 characters or fewer, they're drawn from three sources: Joyce's work, his comments, and the comments of others about him and his work. And by the way, your donations have attached themselves to another story of success. March was, I think, the highest ever number of downloads of the podcasts, and the current rate is heading for an average of 1,200 downloads a day. That's a vote for culture, in my view, as well as a vote for James A. Joyce. And so, to this week. It's still Thursday morning in 1904. Sunny, a little breezy later, 16th of June. And Leopold Bloom, an advertising salesman in his late 30s, is out and about in Dublin, and he's watching a rich, and to him therefore exotic woman, climbing up on a sidecar outside the Grosvenor Hotel in Westland Row. But his concentration is being marred by a man named C.P. McCoy, who's nattering to him about the fellow whose funeral Mr. Bloom will attend later in the day. Here's this week's text. He moved a little to the side of McCoy's talking head. Getting up in a minute. What's wrong with him? He said. He's dead, he said. And faith, he filled up. Is it Paddy Dignam? I said. I couldn't believe it when I heard it. I was with him no later than Friday last, or Thursday was it, in the Arch? Yes, he said, he's gone. He died on Monday, poor fellow. Watch. Silk flash, rich stockings, white, watch. A heavy tramcar, honking its gong, slewed between. Lost it. Curse your noisy pug-nose. Fields locked out of it. Paradise and the Perry. All was happening like that at the very moment. Girl in Eustace Street hallway Monday. Was it settling her garter? Her friend covering the display of Esprit de Corps. Well, what are you gaping at? End of text. And there's a little narration, a bunch of Mr. Bloom's thoughts, and some interesting other stuff in there. So here we go. First, let me identify for you the sentences that Joyce added after he had written the manuscript that's in the Rosenbach Museum. 3 sentences in all, and they come after Mr. Bloom thinks the words, the very moment, and those sentences are, girl in Eustace Street hallway, Monday was it, settling her garter? Her friend covering the display of Esprit de Corps. Well, what are you gaping at? Now, I get to those again, of course, in the unpacking. So what are we seeing here? Well, as you know from last week, Mr. Bloom is trying to focus on the rich, classy, and to him, therefore, exotic and erotic woman about to mount a horse-drawn cab, a sidecar across the street. And C.P. McCoy, whom he has just bumped into, is yapping about their mutual friend Paddy Dignam, whose funeral we shall all attend in the next chapter. He moved a little to the side of McCoy's talking head. That's Joyce, describing Mr. Bloom's focus. Getting up in a minute, that's Mr. Bloom's thought as he watches the progress of the rich woman to the sidecar. And the dialogue from McCoy intrudes again, in that thing that Joyce does so well, reported speech, the very definition of colloquialism. And there's a terrific little trick in here. I'll read the sentences together, and I'll also remind you of some dialogue from last week. In fact, I'll do that first, in which McCoy asked the question of Bob Doran and Conway's pub regarding Paddy Dignam. What's wrong with him? Now we pick up on the sentence as it's echoed by McCoy, who is reporting how Doran echoed McCoy's sentence. There's a layer for you. And the inflection, and here's the point, the inflection is to be found in the writing on the page. In God's name, how do you do inflection? Well, I'll show you in a moment. So, last week, we had McCoy saying, what's wrong with him? And now Doran echoes it. What's wrong with him, he said. He's dead, he said. Get it? Bob Doran repeated McCoy's question and then answered it. And Joyce tells us that merely by adding the two he says. Terrific. What's wrong with him, he said. He's dead, he said. The text now continues. With just a little flash of direct speech, McCoy to Bloom, in faith, he filled up, meaning his eyes brimmed with tears. That's stored in the pub. Now, reported speech again. Is it Paddy Dignam, I said. That's McCoy reporting his own question, to which he adds, now in direct speech to Mr. Bloom, I couldn't believe it when I heard it. I was with him no later than Friday last, or Thursday was it, in the Arch. Yes, he said, he's gone. He died on Monday, poor fella. You see, that's a great piece of typical Dublin working class or lower middle class dialogue in which there are parts played by the conveyor of the news as though he were on stage. Now see what happens. More drama. Mr. Bloom's thoughts. Watch, watch. Silk flash, rich stockings white, watch. And now, Joyce's narration. A heavy tramcar, honking its gong, slewed between. So you have a lift of the heart, and perhaps other parts, told in Mr. Bloom's thoughts, and then a disappointment. He's alerting himself to the fact that the woman is climbing up on the sidecar. He even gets that elusive Edwardian glimpse of stocking. Silk flash, rich stockings, white watch. And then Joyce reports the disappointment of the tram coming between Mr. Bloom and his vision at just the wrong moment. Lost it. Poor Mr. Bloom. He's furious. His thoughts round on McCoy, and in his silent attack we learn at a single stroke of the pen what McCoy looks like. Curse your noisy pug nose, Mr. Bloom thinks. Can't you see him? Can't you see the face? Little boxer's nose. Isn't that so clever? And now we come to one of those flashing moments of depth that Joyce also did so well. Mr. Bloom's next two thoughts are, feels locked out of it. That's plain enough, given that he's been fantasizing about making love to this rich woman who is evidently so far above him socially, but that's part of the turn-on. But then the line he comes up with the next is a little different. Paradise and the Perry. Let's address the better-known reference first, the Peer and the Perry. In 1882, the year of Joyce's birth, Gilbert and Sullivan produced their operetta Iolanthe, with its subtitle of The Peer and the Perry. It's an account of the strife between the British ruling class and the fairies, the little people, the sprites that they represented in the musical comedy. They weren't quite an accurate representation of the true ancient definition of a Peri, which is spelled P-E-R-I. That comes from Persian. And in ancient Persian mythology, a Peri was originally a bad girl, a malevolent female sprite who caused storms and earthquakes and crop failures and comets. She improved, though, and became a good fairy, something of an angel. But that isn't quite the connection to paradise that Mr. Bloom now makes in his mind, no. He's actually quoting or thinking of another Irishman, Thomas Moore. Most interesting fellow. Now that would be a mighty digression. Tom Moore. Tom Moore in 1817 published a piece of work named Lalla Rookh. It's quite famous. Lalla Rookh, R-O-O-K-H. It's a suite of 4 poems with prose commentary, prose links that Moore wrote to explain the poem. Now, the second poem in the suite is called Paradise and the Peri, and it tells of how paradise is, in principle, denied to the Peri, because they're not good enough, as this particular paradise of this woman is now being denied to Mr. Bloom. The best summation of the poem is in 3 lines. The Peri yet may be forgiven, who brings to this eternal gate the gift that is most dear to heaven. That's the basic principle. To get to heaven, the Peri has to bring gifts. You'll have to forgive my shorthand. There's no brief way, ever, of getting into anything by Thomas Moore. And by the way, if Paradise and the Peri sounds familiar, Schumann set it to music as an oratorio, and parts of it are actually very beautiful. I haven't heard it for a while. Now, of course, I must go and listen to it again, because my curiosity has been re-stimulated. I don't think I knew when I heard it first that it was out of Ulysses. that there was a Ulysses connection. But you never know the moment in Ulysses when a tiny sentence or reference will set off a much bigger reference. Where are we? Yes, Mr. Bloom laments, if you look at it, the loss of his momentary paradise, as though he's the Peri, the half-angel, who hasn't yet done enough good works to get into heaven. And finally his thoughts complain with some hint of bitterness at how frequently life cuts into one's such fleeting pleasures. Always happening like that. That's what he thinks, the very moment. And he recalls an incident that he's had earlier in the week when he did catch a glimpse of stocking. Girl in Eustace Street hallway. Monday was it? Settling her garter. Her friend covering the display of esprit de corps. Well, what are you gaping at? And in there we find a joke. Esprit de corps obviously means, literally, the spirit of the body, but it's also part of an old amused military trope that a girl who flashes some flesh at the soldiers is doing it for their morale. Esprit de corps. In fact, such a girl's contribution can travel up that same scale quite a lot. Not in Eustace Street that Monday for Mr. Bloom, though, because the girl's pal ran him from the scene. Hey, what are you gaping at? And with his uncanny gift of the unconscious, Joyce uses a word to describe not only Mr. Bloom's stare, but what he's staring at. Look at the word gaping. He has seen, hasn't he, a gaping expanse of thigh. That's it. Thank you again for your donations. Catch up with rejoicings on Twitter. And there's an ebook, the first dozen or so, first baker's dozen of these podcasts is available on Amazon at $3.99. See you next week. Rejoice, episode 204, Funeral Tricks. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're in the merry month of May, and ahead of me I see 5 podcasts for the month, because this week we also have, in 2 days from now, on Friday, a Baker's Dozen edition. See how your donations are helping? And thank you for them so much. I'm delighted to have them. It's a wonderful vote of confidence, a leap of faith, and it enables me to keep all this and the rejoicing streets going. In terms of the running podcast this week, we're still at Western Row in Dublin City Centre at around 10 o'clock in the morning of Thursday, June the 16th, 1904, and Mr. Bloom is still trying not to have a conversation with a casual acquaintance, the pug-nosed C.P. McCoy. At least I think he's the pug-nosed one anyway. There is some argument as to whether or not Mr. Bloom meant the tram driver who stopped him from seeing the lady in the sidecar. So I'm going to say McCoy is pug-nosed. And it now seems as though he is at last about to move off. Let me briefly bring you up to speed on this encounter. Mr. Bloom has a secret letter in his pocket that he's been desperate to read. He picked it up at Western Row Post Office, addressed to him in his clandestine pseudonym of Henry Flower, and he didn't want this conversation with McCoy. It interrupts him. They've been talking about their wives and forthcoming concerts, both wives as singers, and about the funeral that morning yet to come of their mutual friend Patty Dignam. So here's this week's text. He moved to go. That's McCoy about to move on. Well, glad to see you looking fit, he said. Meet you knocking around. Yes, Mr. Bloom said. Tell you what, McCoy said. You might put down my name at the funeral, will you? I'd like to go, but I mightn't be able, you see. There's a drowning case at Sandy Cove may turn up, and then the coroner and myself would have to go down if the body is found. You just shove in my name if I'm not there, will you? I'll do that, Mr. Bloom said, moving to get off. That'll be all right. Right, McCoy said brightly. Thanks, old man. I'd go if I possibly could. Well, ta-lol. Just C.P. McCoy will do. That will be done, Mr. Bloom answered firmly. Didn't catch me napping that wheeze. The quick touch. Soft mark I'd like my job. Valise I have a particular fancy for. Leather. Capped corners, riveted edges, double action lever lock. Bob Cowley lent him his for the Wicklow Regatta concert last year, and never heard tidings of it from that good day to this. There we go. End of excerpt. Now, let me see for a start how much of this was not in the original manuscript. Ooh. quite a lot, actually. And as the additions are so telling in how Joyce built Ulysses, why don't I wait and identify them as we go along? So here we go. First sentence. He moved to go. That's straightforward narration, and that's McCoy getting ready to depart. Well, glad to see you looking fit, he said. Meet you knocking around. That's also self-explanatory. Interesting little slang phrase in there, though. Knocking around. And knock was a slang, 18th century term for a hooker, a prostitute. And to knock around was to wander a little aimlessly, or seemingly aimlessly, like a streetwalker looking for business. And isn't it fascinating to find the phrase here, just as Mr. Bloom is contemplating the letter in his pocket? And Mr. Bloom just answers, patient and polite, yes, but McCoy's not finished yet. And now we'll see a little of Joyce building his novel. Tell you what, McCoy said, you might put my name down at the funeral, will you? I'd like to go, but I mightn't be able, you see. Now, that wasn't an unusual practice. You can't get to a funeral, but you want to be there in spirit, so you ask somebody you know who is going to the funeral to put your name down in the mourner's attendance book. I don't know if they still have them, but I remember them at funerals, in Ireland anyway. Now, here's the point, and here's the rebuilding thing, or the building thing, I should say. McCoy next gives a reason why he won't be there. He's a minor public official, as are so many of Joyce's characters, across his work. McCoy works for the coroner, and he tells Mr. Bloom, there's a drowning case at Sandy Cove, may turn up, and then the coroner and myself would have to go down if the body is found. A drowning case at Sandy Cove. And the coroner and McCoy would have to be there when they put in the body. Do you remember in the first chapter, the first segment of Ulysses Telemachus? It's in episode 50. Episode 50, yes, it's in episode 50. Remember the man that was drowned? A sail veering about the blank bay, waiting for a swollen bundle to bob up, roll over to the sun, a puffy face, salt white, here I am. That's Stephen thinking. Now, this McCoy thing of him having to go out to Sandy Cove, hold on a second, I want to just check the Gabler edition, which I have here in paperback, and yes, it's on page 18. Do you remember there are two men standing on the top of the cliff looking out to sea, looking for this body? Yes, you see, this is what I mean by how Joyce built Ulysses. At some stage in the process, almost certainly when he was reading the printer's galleys, the proofs, of which, as you know, he's believed to have ordered 6 copies and made emendations on every one, at some stage in that process, he decided to bring in the drowned man again. The idea that he had of the two men standing on a cliff top, watching, and Stephen knowing that somebody is supposed to have been drowned out there. The drowned man. Also mentioned in the tarot, is that right? I'm not sure. But what's great about this is it builds depth. Continuum is one of a novelist's best tools. The life of the book going onward for the novel's characters, as it does with us all in real life. So, McCoy explains why he won't be at the funeral, and then he asks Mr. Bloom, you just shove in my name if I'm not there, will you? And Mr. Bloom answers, I'll do that, and edges away. And then he adds, that'll be all right, because Mr. Bloom is an obliging fellow. And next, we have a stunning piece of writing accuracy, one of Joyce's gifts of observation. He knew so much about how people interact. Over and over in Ulysses, you find these myriad flashes of absolute, spot-on authenticity in dialogue. This is what I mean. I'll read it to you again. Right, McCoy said brightly. Thanks, old man. I'd go if I possibly could. Well, tal-al, just C.P. McCoy will do. McCoy is leaving the conversation, but he's prolonging it. You've done it yourself. Go, but don't go. Going, but not gone yet. A last word. Tal-al, by the way, is the same as toodaloo or toodlepip, slang goodbyes. And They're believed to be onomatopoeic, originating with the sound of a carriage horn. And finally, Mr. Bloom closes him out. "That will be done," Mr. Bloom answered firmly. Decent chap. Next, we have a set of thoughts from Mr. Bloom, also added post-manuscript. And this, too, is continuum, but perhaps even more delightful. Because it's not just continuum from Ulysses, it's continuum from Dubliners. Remember how I told you last week that one of McCoy's wheezes, his scam, is borrowing luggage and taking it to the pawn shop? It's in the story Grace. McCoy is described as having made a crusade in search of valises and portmanteaux to enable Mrs. McCoy to fulfill imaginary engagements in the country, is the phrase. Well, it's worth repeating this week because now we have Mr. Bloom's full set of thoughts on the subject, all added, as I say, by Joyce at proof stage, and summarizing McCoy's stunt, and what Mr. Bloom knows of it, and how wary he is. So he thinks, "Didn't catch me napping, that wheeze. The quick touch, soft mark." That's to say, as if Bloom were susceptible to McCoy's very quick introduction of the possibility of borrowing luggage. Mr. Bloom scoffs at it. "I'd like my job." In other words, there's no chance I'm ever going to fall for that. And then he thinks about the luggage. "Valise, I have a particular fancy for leather, capped corners, riveted edges, double action lever lock." So he likes a good suitcase. And then he goes on to reflect upon the scam, on McCoy's scam, and its reputation. This is Mr. Bloom still thinking. Bob Cowley lent him his for the Wicklow Regatta concert last year, and never heard tidings of it from that good day to this. Now look at that passage. How much is in all of that? The knowingness as to the contract. Didn't catch me napping on that wheeze. I wasn't asleep when he tried to pull that one. The quick touch, soft mark. These are street criminal terms. And there's more ironic colloquialism in that phrase, "I'd like my job." That's Dublinese for "no way." And finally, Mr. Bloom's touch of luxurious fantasy by which we will come to know him. "Valise, I have a particular fancy for leather capped corners, riveted edges, double action lever lock." Can't you just see the piece of luggage? And isn't Joyce also telling us a little piece of social history? That's what posh 1904 luggage looked like. And Mr. Bloom finally produces an example from gossip to confirm his prejudice, proof, lest he accuse himself of unfair suspicion. Bob Cowley lent him his for the Wicklow Regatta concert last year, and never heard tidings of it from that good day to this. Bob Cowley's interesting. He comes into Ulysses almost 40 times, and he is almost always referred to as Father Cowley because of his serious flirtation with the Catholic priesthood, a flirtation that was never consummated. And, by the way, the Wicklow Regatta is still a great social event south of Dublin every August. In fact, I think it's still running. This week. Thanks for the donations. Please keep them coming. Rejoice, episode 204A. Location. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. This, I think, is my 17th special edition. Baker's Dozen. Extra episode. Every 13th is a separate essay and so on. Regular listeners know the drift. And just thinking aloud for a moment, what are the topics we've covered in these bonus episodes? Well, there were the stories in Dubliners. We, early on, had a little Joyce family biography. There was the writing of Ulysses. There was Joyce as an impressionist artist and not just a novelist. There was his astounding reading list. And that was his reading list as evidenced in just the first few chapters of Ulysses. Did I also do an essay on Sylvia Beach? I think so. Anyway, they're all there, archived on my website, www.frankdelaney.com, and they're on iTunes too, all free, and now helped considerably by your generous donations. The donate button is also on my website if you want to drop a tip in the jar. And this time, in this essay, my tangential offering, which is the point of these, to do something tangential with the main drift of the podcast, the deconstruction of Ulysses. This time my tangential offering has to do with the locations in the novel, including, over the first 5 chapters, which is how far we've come in the podcasts, looking at the corresponding locations in Homer's Odyssey. Okay, I'll come clean. I'm just looking for an excuse to revisit from my armchair one of my favorite texts in the world, the original Odyssey by Homer. And it's my great good luck that Joyce used it as a framework, often a very loose framework, for his own great work. You see, I have this fond idea, and I've cherished this notion for years, that one day I will, physically, myself, on trains and boats and planes, whatever it takes, I will visit every place mentioned by Homer, insofar as they can still be identified. I've been to quite a few of them. Troy, for instance, and there's been quite a lot of work done on the subject of Homer's places, and by actual travellers too, not just scholars. And I just think that seeing the places through which Odysseus and his son Telemachus travelled, and all their companions and all the people they met, I just think that will bring such an extra insight to Joyce's Dublin Odyssey, which he called Ulysses, the Roman version of the name Odysseus. But you know that already because I've told you several times. So, let's begin at the beginning. And because the regular weekly podcasts are, as I say, currently dissecting Chapter 5, which Joyce, in his later explication of the novel, calls Lotus Eaters. That title, by the way, is not in the book itself. I'll therefore only look at the first 5 locations and take a look at their cross-referencing. Ulysses, the novel, Joyce's novel, as you and the world and his aunt now know, begins on a Martello Tower, one of those strange round fortresses that the English built to defend against Napoleon. This one is now a Joyce museum, and it is, of course, in Sandycove, south of Dublin, which is now a posh and rather tony suburb. In 1904, it was something of a commuter's seaside village. The opening chapter in Joyce's schema is called Telemachus. He was a boy grown to man in the 10 years of his father's absence. Telemachus was the son of the wandering Odysseus. And Homer's structure begins in 2 different places, one after the other. Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, where the gods discuss Odysseus and his family, and Ithaca, the island where Telemachus lives with his mother Penelope, Odysseus' wife. Mount Olympus is in eastern mainland Greece. It's, I think, about 10,000 feet high or thereabouts. You can see it from the road. I would call it northwest of the city of Thessalonica. I'm doing this from memory. Thessaloniki, or Thessalonica, by the way, it's a very attractive city, well worth a visit. And it's a lot of fun from near Thessalonica to look up at Mount Olympus and to imagine the 12 old gods leaning on their elbows up there and looking down over the ledges at us mortals in the world below. And Ithaca, now Ithaca is a small island in the Ionian Sea. It's south of Corfu, not that far, well, Corfu isn't that far from Albania. And when I say Ithaca is a small island, I mean a small island. I was on nearby Zakynthos, or Xanthe, as they also called it several years ago, watching the pelicans, and I wanted to go to Ithaca for obvious reasons. But I couldn't get a boat to take me there during the day. I'd have had to go back to Piraeus on the mainland. Nobody goes to Ithaca, they told me on Zakynthos. It's too small. I didn't quite believe them. And perhaps it's different now, although the island is, as I say, small. It's about 40 square miles, a few thousand people. I bet they've made better arrangements today. Well, Ithaca is where Odysseus lived. And when he went off to the Trojan Wars, he left behind his wife Penelope and their 10-year-old son Telemachus. Now, in Joyce's Ulysses, we begin with only a notion of Mount Olympus. In real life, Joyce's drinking companion, the medical student Oliver St. John Gogarty, or Oliver St. John Gogarty, forever doomed to be lampooned by Joyce as the unpleasant, nasty even, Buck Mulligan in Ulysses. In real life, Gogarty joked that they must make this Martello Tower, which he had rented for the summer, that they must make it the navel of the world. as Delphi in Greece had been declared. Delphi was the great shrine to the gods. So, with Stephen as Telemachus, at this mock Irish temple, there with his companions, who are too few and not noisy enough to represent the rowdy suitors who are in pursuit of Penelope's hand in marriage, because they all assume that Odysseus, absent now for 10 years, is dead. That's how we begin, with a tenuous enough connection by Joyce to the Odyssey. And here in this first chapter, the goddess Athena visits Telemachus, this is in the Odyssey, and procures a boat for him so that he can go off in search for his father. In Joyce's hands, the goddess is an old woman who brings the milk for the breakfast. I told you he was tenuous at times. In other words, we don't begin in Ulysses exactly, precisely in Ithaca, though we do end up there. But that's a long story, and we're working towards it. The next thing that happens in the Odyssey is that Telemachus sets forth, as does Stephen in Ulysses. Telemachus journeys south from Ithaca, past the shoulder of Cephallenia, past the east coast of Zyginthos. I wonder if it had pelicans then, 600-700 years before the birth of Christ. And he travels on south until he reached Pylos on the mainland of Greece. And Pylos was the home of old Nestor, a former warrior and now something of a sage, who, with others sitting about, including his sons, instructs Telemachus, gives him advice about his father, whom he knew. And Stephen in Ulysses also sets forth into the world. He leaves the Martello Tower and he walks along the coast. In Joyce's hands, the people sitting around are, to begin with, men bathing naked at the 40-foot, a bathing place near the Martello Tower. It's there this day. And the village of Dalkey is kind of geographically like Pylos in that it's on the sea. Nestor is represented by the headmaster of the school who has employed Stephen, and who tosses out random and not very profound, foolish almost, pieces of advice. And Nestor's sons from the Odyssey are loosely represented by the boys, the schoolboys in the classroom. And Joyce, in the chapter, even touches on classical themes and battles, because Homer's Nestor had been a famous warrior, a charioteer. I think we went into all that from memory. These chapter numbers, they're like sort of counters that tick up in my head. I would think it was around episode 53 or 54 on, if you want to look up the archives. Now, in the schema that Joyce outlined long after the writing, he even called the second chapter Nestor. And by the way, as I say, and this is worth emphasizing, Telemachus journeyed south, as did Stephen. Two of them, absolute parallel. There is a very clear parallel at that moment in the book. And may I make the point here? There have been long centuries of enjoyable arguments as to the true identities of the places in Homer. There's nothing I'd like more, believe me, than to get stuck into those arguments. And were I independently wealthy, that would be, without a doubt, a considerable part of how I would spend my time, looking up Homer's places. But for now, I'm going to settle on the Homeric places upon which people seem generally to agree. So, Telemachus has left Ithaca and has journeyed to Pylos and Nestor. Stephen has left the Martello Tower and has journeyed to Mr. Deasy's school in Dalkey, where there was a real-life school and where Joyce himself did some temporary teaching in the spring of 1904. That's one of the many, many instances where Ulysses hews more than closely to Joyce's own life, which was part of the point of the book, really. There is definitely autobiography in it. So from Dalkey, we next find Stephen walking where? On Sandy Mount Strand. This is the point of the book where most readers have foundered, at the ineluctable modality of the visible, the famous phrase, a contemplation that includes the philosophical suggestion that we are all shaped by what we see. Here now we have a more complex relationship to Homer's geography. The schema names the chapter as Proteus. Proteus was the god of the sea, a shapeshifter, capable of changing into many forms. But now Telemachus has come around the coast to modern-day Malea, and he's at the court of Menelaus, This is the Odyssey, remember, not Joyce. Menelaus was one of the heroes of the Trojan War, and he's the lucky fellow. Can you hear my irony? He is the lucky guy who, in the drawing of straws, won the hand of Helen of Troy and married her, the face that launched 1,000 ships. Therefore, Menelaus knew Odysseus, and Telemachus goes to him, because unlike Odysseus, Menelaus made it home safely from Troy, and he will tell Telemachus how he did it. That's the hope. That's Telemachus's hope. His journey wasn't without incident. Storms blew him off course. In Crete once, they showed me where Menelaus was shipwrecked. But in his difficulty, what did he do? He managed to grab the Lord of the Sea, Proteus, and by holding him prisoner, stopped him from shape-shifting for long enough to learn how to get home. So, Stephen is on a rocky shore. At the end of the chapter, he's actually leaning on rocks at the edge of Sandymount Strand. Now, if in the chapter you're looking for a figure corresponding to Menelaus the warrior, have a glance again at somebody about whom Stephen reminisces, Kevin Egan, the old Irish nationalist bomb thrower whom Stephen recalls meeting in Paris. And if you want to, you can also see the cockle-picking gypsy girl on the Strand as Helen. Just a thought. Stephen does, after all, imagine her charming men under the nighttime arches of Dublin's inner city. Call it a stretch if you like, but Ulysses to me is often like the Bible, capable of many interpretations. I wonder if that's blasphemous, comparing Ulysses to the Bible. Oh well. And as to Proteus again, the god of change, likewise, Stephen is somewhat adrift on this shore. He has poor eyesight. Autobiography again, Joyce's eyes were terrible. And his thoughts return again and again to the many sad moods of his life. And as the tide comes in, we have to remember that he is in the grip of a sea change in his own life. There's an important point here of continuum 3 months earlier, at the end of Stephen's previous narrative, a portrait of the artist as a young man. He has decided to change his life, to fly the nets of Aaron's and religion's terrible embraces, and leave the country forever, leave his native land, taking with him as his weapons, famously, silence, exile, and cunning. That's one heck of a change. So, for Sandymount Strand, consider the rocky shores of Malia or Malia in southern Greece. Some of the titles that Joyce gave to his chapters have often puzzled me slightly. I can see completely why he called the last chapter Ithaca. Molly Bloom's soliloquy from deep in her bedroom defines a woman at home. But he named chapter 4 Calypso. Now this chapter is where we first meet Joyce's Odysseus, Leopold Bloom. The name Leopold, as I think I mentioned, means in a later incarnation the people's prince, but that only came from a royal fashion of Leopold princes in Germany and Eastern Europe. The original name means a brave man. Odysseus, a brave man. Leopold Bloom, a brave man. Be sure, by the way, that Joyce knew that before he used it, because I don't think he ever deployed a word, especially a person or place name, without knowing its etymology and having a very good visual or oral reason for putting it down on the page. So why, now, is chapter 4 called Calypso? Well, she's the nymph in Homer, with whom Odysseus spent 7 years, enthralled to her, desperate to get away from her, but succumbing to her every night and going to her bed. And yet, Joyce's chapter 4 corresponds to Book 5 of the Odyssey. Slight displacement there. The island, by the way, on which Homer placed Calypso was Ogygia, one of the few Odyssey locations to have occasioned so much scholarship. It has been studied to within an inch of its rocky life. From the earliest scribes onward, the debates have rolled and rolled. Some have even put it as far away as Gozo off Malta. Others will tell you that there's an island north and west of Corfu, which even has Calypso's cave pointed out to tourists, but so does Gozo. Others say it was Atlantis, long swallowed by the sea, and yet others say that Homer invented it. I'm still with Ogygia. But whatever it was, Homer certainly idyllicized it. Let me read to you for a moment from Book 5 of Samuel Butler's Odyssey translation. Here we are. You'll want to go there when you read this. When you read this, you'll want to go there and be with the nymph Calypso. Here's the passage. When the messenger of the gods is sent to tell Calypso that she must release Odysseus and let him go home to his wife. Here's the passage. The messenger of the gods. He found her, that's Calypso, at home. There was a large fire burning on the hearth, and one could smell from afar the fragrant reek of burning cedar and sandalwood. As for herself, Calypso, she was busy at her loom, shooting her golden shuttle through the warp and singing beautifully. Round her cave there was a thick wood of alder, poplar, and sweet-smelling cypress trees, wherein all kinds of great birds had built their nests, owls, hawks, and chattering sea-crows that occupied their business in the waters. A vine loaded with grapes was trained and grew luxuriantly about the mouth of the cave. There were also 4 running rills of water, in channels cut pretty close together, and turned hither and thither, so as to irrigate the beds of violets and luscious herbage over which they flowed. See? I told you you'd want to be there. I don't blame Odysseus for leaving that place. I must look at some other translations too soon. I don't know why, but I'm beginning to tire a little of Butler, perhaps because he was so long ago. Now, how does that idyllic description of this island on which Odysseus was trapped by this nymph Calypso, how does that correspond with Mr. Bloom and his home in Chapter 4? Why did Joyce name it Calypso? Well, the implication in the Odyssey, in Homer, is that Calypso's island is at the very center, the navel of the sea. Odysseus is bound to it, as I say. Even though it makes him miserable, he is there every night. It is a place where there is food and drink, and sadness. Now think of this. Joyce's island of Ogygia is the bed in which Molly is lying, not the house, the marital bed, to which Mr. Bloom returns every night, to which he has fetched tea and bread and butter that morning, where Molly the enchantress has received and opened a letter from the seducer Blazes Boylan, and where there is another nymph under consideration, Millie Bloom, daughter of Molly and Leopold, who, down in Mullingar, the lake-surrounded centre of Ireland, is probably about to have her first sexual appearance, and who, at the age of 15, is shapely enough for her father, somewhat improperly, to have noticed her emerging sexuality. And if that's not enough nymph to be going on with, there's actually a painting or a poster in the room with nymphs on it. The regular podcasts, my weekly editions, are in the middle of Joyce's Chapter 5 at the moment, The Lotus Eaters. Let me quote Butler's translation again. This is Homer Book 9. I was driven by foul winds for a space of 9 days upon the sea, but on the 10th day we reached the land of the Lotus Eater, who live on a food that comes from a kind of flower. Here we landed to take in fresh water, and our crews got their midday meal on the shore near the ships. When they had eaten and drunk, I sent 2 of my company to see what manner of men the people of the place might be, and they had a 3rd man under them. They started at once, and went about among the lotus eaters, who did them no hurt, but gave them to eat of the lotus, which was so delicious that those who ate of it left off caring about home, and did not even want to go back and say what happened to them, but were for staying and munching lotus with the lotus eater, without thinking further of their return. Well, as we know, in the chapter Joyce called the Lotus Eaters, Mr. Bloom's out and about in Dublin. Early in the morning he has left home. I'll not take away from what has yet to come in the regular podcasts. No spoilers, no spoiler alerts. But already you'll have observed that there have been sensuous things and sensations at work in that chapter. It's not that he decided that Dublin was the land of the Lotus Eaters. Dublin was essentially Joyce's Aegean Sea and his Mediterranean for the purpose of his Odyssey. Instead, he goes in this chapter for the kind of sensations reportedly enjoyed by the mild-eyed, melancholy lotus-eaters, as Tennyson called them. The lotus-eaters, the pleasant languor, the sleepiness, the sensual lassitude, tired eyelids upon tired eyes, in Tennyson's poem. As to the location of the lotus-eaters, and here I really do want to go. Antiquarian historians, some of them almost contemporary to Homer, certainly not that many centuries after him, they say the lotus eaters lived on Jerba, an island off Tunisia, North Africa, and they were saying that kind of thing several centuries BC. And that would suggest an interesting geographical scheme on Homer's part. Gozo, as I say, claimed by some scholars for Calypso, and there's a Calypso's cave there too. Gozo's within easy sailing distance of Jerba in North Africa. See what I mean by fascinating, this Homeric Joycean location business? Yes, I've got to go there. Normal service will be resumed, that is the weekly podcast as usual, next Wednesday. And please, if the spirit moves you, hit the donate button on my website. And thank you for your company. Rejoice, episode 205, Soft Soap and Smallpox. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. On we go, into the sunlight of Thursday morning, the 16th of June, 1904, the day of the Ascot Gold Cup, and myriad other occurrences, great and small, which we will come to through the years and, of course, the decades. Leopold Bloom is on West End Row now, and his conversation with C.P. McCoy has, he hopes, just concluded. McCoy, too, has a singing wife. They vie, she and Mrs. Bloom, for concert engagements. And Mr. Bloom has just trumped McCoy on 2 counts. 1, Molly Bloom, a.k.a. Mrs. Marion Bloom, has a posh, a swell, a swagger engagement coming up at the Ulster Hall in Belfast. And 2, because they have to travel north 100 miles or so, Mrs. Bloom will be needing her luggage, therefore McCoy cannot borrow it and take it to the pawn shop or sell it to raise money, a stunt for which he is well known, and Mr. Bloom is somewhat pleased with himself for having nipped that little scam in the bud. Now read on. Here's this week's text. It's composed, as is typical, of snatches of narration, yes, set against Mr. Bloom's internal dialogue with himself. Here we go. Mr. Bloom, strolling towards Brunswick Street, smiled. My missus has just got an rady, freckled soprano, cheese-paring nose, nice enough in its way, for a little ballad, no guts in it. You and me, don't you know, in the same boat, soft soaping. Give him the needle, that would. Can't he hear the difference? I think he's that way inclined a bit, against my grain somehow. Thought that Belfast would fetch him. I hope that smallpox up there doesn't get worse. Suppose she wouldn't let herself be vaccinated again. Your wife and my wife. Wonder is he pimping after me? End of text. To begin with, let me just check how much of this changed from the original manuscript. And by the way, actually, yes, this is a good moment to explain the relationship between the original manuscript, the handwritten Ulysses that you can see in the wonderful Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, and the final text of the novel as we know it today. I warn you, though, simplifying this history, and as you well know, simplification, clarification is the object of this entire podcast exercise. Simplifying this can be likened to explaining quantum theory in, say, the words of a limerick. Well, here's the easiest way to approach it. And if you ever go to the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, and oh Lord, you should, and I'll be there in a month or so for their outstanding Bloomsday celebrations. If you go there, they'll explain it much better to you. In 1917, Ezra Pound, poet, wild man, who was acting as a literary advisor to various publications and a literary editor for some, he had been tracking Joyce's work and getting it before the public. Now, to further this, Joyce needed to have versions that a typist could read. So he copied out all 18 episodes, and that's the Rosenbach manuscript. It's the only complete version of Ulysses in Joyce's own handwriting. And there couldn't be another kind because he originally composed the novel on scraps of paper and school notebooks and jotters and stuff, which he then collated, and from which he then drafted, say, a full chapter. But after much wrangling, decades of wrangling among scholars, it's now somewhat generally agreed that when he was writing out what we might call Ulysses so far, he hadn't entirely satisfied himself with every last revision, and even in some cases, perhaps some of the writing. Now, in terms of Joycean scholarship, this is almost obscene shorthand that I'm offering you, in a crazy attempt to summarize years of research by distinguished scholars, but it does at least explain the difference between the Rosenbach manuscript and the text I'm using, which is now, and will be from now on, the Gabler, and that published first in 1984. That represents colossal efforts to get the truest copy of Ulysses that Joyce intended. And now, just for the purpose of this podcast, let me further explain that a New York lawyer, John Quinn, now he's worth a baker's dozen essay all in his own. Quinn was asked to help Joyce financially, and as Quinn was a great art collector, he offered to buy this handwritten text. It was a way of giving money to Joyce. And when Quinn, eventually disposed of his entire art collection, which was very considerable, a book collector from Philadelphia called Rosenbach bought the handwritten Ulysses. Actually, I must also do an entire baker's dozen on that whole arena of the handwritten drafts and the comparisons with the latest editions of the novel. It's too tempting not to. And you know what? I might do one on Dr. Rosenbach himself. Anyway, thusly, and etc. What is different? Let me look in this week's text from what Joyce wrote out by hand. Yes, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 changes, all additions. Here they are briefly. I'll identify them further as we go along. Cheese-paring nose, soft soaping, think he's that way inclined a bit, against migraine somehow. I hope that smallpox up there doesn't get worse. Suppose she wouldn't let herself be vaccinated again. All added to the text by Joyce at a later date. So, now, let's do some unpacking. The first sentence is fairly obvious. Joyce narrating. Mr. Bloom, strolling towards Brunswick Street, smiled. Brunswick Street is now Pierce Street. Now we hear from Mr. Bloom's own thoughts as to why he's smiling. He's recalling his own words to McCoy. My missus just got an... And the next word, had he continued the thought, would have been engagement. By the way, Mr. Bloom does that hesitant thing quite often, doesn't finish the sentence in his mind. And we'll come to that more noticeably and more frequently later on in the novel. And now his smile widens. This is a little malicious. Now his smile widens as he considered Mrs. McCoy's voice. Reedy, freckled soprano. And he considers her face, cheese-paring nose, which Joyce added later, as I say. Interesting little doubling up there. Mrs. McCoy must have had an aquiline nose, because a hooked nose was often in slang called a cheese cutter, because it was shaped like a cheese knife. But, cheese-paring, now that's something different. It's a term for miserly behavior, penny pinching. And we already know that Mr. McCoy, and we'll come to it again in a moment, we already know that Mr. McCoy is tricky when it comes to acquiring money. Now, after his derogatory thought about her nose, Mr. Bloom disparages Mrs. McCoy's voice again. Nice enough in its way for a little ballad. No guts in it. He's having a fine time, is Leopold Bloom, denigrating Mrs. McCoy and her face and her voice. Whatever his own difficulties with his wife Molly, this is one loyal husband, in some respects. His thoughts continue, recalling McCoy's ingratiations. You and me, don't you know, in the same boat. He disagrees with McCoy's flatteries, his soft soaping. Joyce added that. Well, we all know what soft soap is. It's a mixture of soap and liquid soap. It's very emollient. And it's soft to soft soap somebody is a fairly derogatory term. It's insincere flattery. And Mr. Bloom thinks how that annoys him. Give you the needle, that would. In other words, that jabs my sensibilities. And then, still being superior about the voices of the respective wives, Mr. Bloom asks himself a question about McCoy's taste. Can't he hear the difference between his wife and Molly? Meaning, doesn't he know that my Molly's voice is superior to his wife's? And then Mr. Bloom reconsiders McCoy's flattery. In these two added sentences, think he's that way inclined a bit, against my grain somehow. Holier than thou, he now goes on to gloat a little in his thoughts as to how he conquered McCoy, vanquished him, by saying that Molly had a gig, a swagger affair, remember? Coming up in Belfast. Thought that Belfast would fetch him, meaning that Belfast reference. And then he stops in his thoughts and thinks, I hope that smallpox up there doesn't get worse. Suppose she wouldn't let herself be vaccinated again. Between October 1903 and February 1905, that's to say 1904, right in the middle, there was indeed an outbreak of smallpox in the north of Ireland, 178 cases in all. At the point where Mr. Bloom is worrying about it, June 1904, the outbreak had been running for about 9 months. But, in fact, he needn't have worried too much. The authorities had it so well contained that a mere 9 deaths were recorded. As to vaccination, Molly had already been vaccinated. That was not a pleasant experience, that inoculation. The arm can swell and get infected, which is why, and it leaves a mark, by the way, which is also why Molly might not want it again. Mr. Bloom goes on to reflect then on McCoy. Your wife and my wife, that echoes an old song, but the damn song won't come to mind at the moment. I can't remember it. It's something like my wife is like your life, or you're like us, my... No, it won't come to mind. If I think of it next week, I'll bring it back up. And then he asks the staggering question, as he looks after McCoy. I wonder, is he pimping after me? Pimping? Is McCoy considering some other way of making money out of the Blooms? Or, do you remember earlier a character mentioned called Corny Kelleher, suspected of being a police informer, for which another name was, once upon a time, a pimp? Watch this space, as they say. Thank you for all your donations. Thank you, thank you. They're hugely helpful to me in all kinds of ways, and they help me put up the tweets every day. And don't forget, I do a rejoicing tweet on Twitter every day. Some quote about Joyce from his work, some observation of him, some observation he made, something, anything, Joyce in. It's called rejoicing, and that's the hashtag rejoicing. And I'll be back here next week. Thank you for your company.